Welcome to Pandemic Organizing, a radio show about New Haveners working together to address the immediate and long-term challenges posed by COVID-19. I'm your host, Tom Breen. I want to give first a special shout out to Harry Droz, the man behind the controls, our station manager at WNHH, for making this happen. And today we will be talking all about the Right to Counsel movement and about New Haven Democratic Socialists for America. I'm joined today by Dalia Romanow, Stephen Poland, Alice Prale, and Khadija Hussein. First, thank you all so much for being on the show and for being up for this conversation.
Thank you, Tom.
So maybe I'll throw the first question to Alice, but feel free to ping pong it over to anyone else and we'll just kind of go from there. Right to counsel, if anyone was just listening to the state legislature's housing committee at this very minute, you'll know that they are about to vote on House Bill 6531 as to whether or not to move it out of committee and act concerning the right to counsel in eviction proceedings. Maybe Alice, could you give us the kind of big picture to start? Maybe what does this proposed bill say? What would it do? And kind of more broadly, what is the right to counsel movement? What is it advocating for? What are you all advocating for?
So the Right to Counsel movement is advocating that it should be a right that you have a right to a lawyer when you are facing eviction proceedings. Right now in Connecticut, 80% of landlords have a lawyer when they go to court, compared to 93% of tenants who do not have a lawyer. So that's a major power disparity in the housing court, that tenants do not receive a lawyer, and often the process is much more complicated and difficult from the tenant side of things than it is from the landlord side of things. So we're advocating that it should be a right to have a lawyer when you're having to go into housing court to defend your housing, that you shouldn't have to go through this process alone. Often evictions happen in silence and shame. People feel really badly when they're going through an eviction process, and that adds a whole other layer of stress on top of an already stressful situation that your housing is at risk. So we are advocating that a lawyer should be an absolute right in this process. It also will help rebalance power in favor of tenants. Right now, the power is very much in the hands of landlords, and tenants have very little power when it comes to housing court, to defending their housing, to understanding the systems, to understanding even what their rights are. If they come into housing court, they may not understand that they're being sued for non-payment, but maybe there were extenuating circumstances, no maintenance in the housing, that would be an argument against that eviction case. So they don't necessarily understand all of those pieces of it. So that's why we think this is a really valuable legislation. And I'm going to pass it to Dalia. Do you want to share more of the specifics of the bill?
Sure, I don't mind doing that. So yeah, as you said, Tom, very excitingly right now, there is a vote that's going to be happening in the Housing Committee on Bill HB 6531. So this is not just theoretical. There is a bill that will hopefully be going to the full session after today, as long as things vote in our favor. And you know, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty too much on what the bill says, but basically it would be providing a right to have a lawyer for tenants facing eviction proceedings in Connecticut, be rolling in over 3 years. And the legal counsel would be provided by legal nonprofits in the state that have already been doing this work, just at a much lower capacity because they've had much more limited funding for years and years. So the legal aid organizations that have the expertise here. And I will say just you know, as sort of a note for what we're pushing for, the bill as it's written right now does have an income limit on what tenants are qualified to get that counsel, but the DSA is pushing for and endorsing a right to counsel for all tenants without an income limit, because we believe that the right to housing is so important and fundamental, and that any of us, regardless of our income, are one medical emergency or, you know, anything could happen and we could find ourselves facing an eviction and need an attorney and not be able to afford that. So
now we'll certainly link to the text of the bill itself and then independent articles so the readers can see exactly how it works. But I do want to link for a second where either Dahlia or Alice or anyone else who could maybe provide a bit more insight as to the mechanics of what this bill would provide for. So as someone, I've spent a lot of time in housing court in New Haven over the years, and certainly, I mean, the dynamic of having landlords always or almost always represented by a lawyer and tenants almost never represented by a lawyer rings very true to my experience as a reporter. And the few times that I see tenants do have lawyers, they're almost always New Haven legal aid attorneys. These are legal services attorneys providing representation to really the poorest and neediest in our community. But could you say, or someone say a bit more about, so this bill would guarantee a right to counsel in eviction proceedings, and then would it require the judicial branch to pay a certain amount to legal services organizations to beef up their attorney role so that they can afford to cover this surge in, I mean, if 9 out of 10 tenants are not currently represented, that's going to mean a lot of lawyers. So either Dahlia or Alice or anyone else who feels qualified to jump in on this, is this the state saying that not only are you guaranteed, but we're going to pay for more attorneys, or how does that work?
Yep, the state would be providing the funding, and I can't really, because the language of the bill hasn't been finalized. I don't know exactly what the mechanism would be for that. I don't feel comfortable saying that, but yeah, so be funding provided by the state that would get to these legal services organizations and allow them to bulk up their capacity so that they could provide eventually over 3 years representation to all tenants facing eviction. And so, you know, it is a cost to the state, but I think others will get into this later, that first of all, there's been a lot of federal money with COVID that has been given to the state specifically to help people with housing stability. And so that's something that could help kind of get this program off the ground. And then in the future, there have been many, many studies done in places that have passed right to counsel already and places that have looked into passing right to counsel that show that ultimately it saves states a lot of money because people are avoiding shelter, and shelter is extremely costly to the state.
So the show is called kind of Pandemic Organizing for a reason, not just interested in the what it is that people are interested in accomplishing here, right to counsel, a guaranteed attorney for tenants facing eviction, but also the work that groups of interested in New Haveners do to make this possibility a reality. So maybe I can go to Khadijah and Stephen, maybe Khadijah first and then Stephen, but again, feel free to bounce it around. Maybe could you speak a bit to how you got involved in this right to counsel movement and how you kind of came to think of this as one of the most important issues for you to advocate for at this time? Why is this at the top of your kind of priority list for what the state, what the city need to do right now? Maybe Khadijah first and then Stephen, but also bounce it around.
Yeah, definitely. So we in DSA's Housing Justice Chapter group had been talking about right to counsel back in the fall, but it wasn't until really December that we started, gearing up to have kind of some real chapter-wide conversations about how this could be a priority for us. And, just to bring it back down to New Haven a little bit, this is where I grew up. And New Haven has one of the highest eviction rates in the country. New Haven has, and you've written about this a lot, Tom, New Haven has huge mega landlords who are represented by lawyers whose job it is to help evict people. And so, this is my community, this is my city, and I've seen it change just in, the past decade that I've been aware of the housing stock here. And, as we started to talk about right to counsel in December and reach out to folks who might be interested in different statewide organizations, from member-led groups to legal services, there was a lot of interest, right? Right to counsel has been talked about in Connecticut before, but it hasn't really been talked about in a public-facing way. It's been talked about by legal groups kind of behind the scenes in the legislature, but not really in the kind of organizing way that DSA approached it from. And that was really important to us because as it's been shown in the other cities where right to counsel has passed, it's not just about passing this piece of legislation, but it's about building a public movement that, has tenants, organizers, advocates, lawyers as a part of it. so that if the legislation is passed, and we hope it is, it's not just the law that's in place, but also this movement that's seeking to build a tenant movement and build tenant power beyond right to counsel. And I think we're well on our way to doing that. We have over 40 statewide organizations that have signed on to be part of the coalition, and all of those from very diverse parts of the state, doing very diverse things, but all of them recognizing that right to counsel is this fundamental step towards protecting tenants' rights and building a tenant movement. And Connecticut is a tenant state. This is super, super important both for New Haven and for the state at large.
Stephen, Khadijah spoke about building a movement, not just kind of advocacy up in Hartford. I wonder if you could speak a bit to the actual kind of on the ground or digital or in whatever sphere it takes place. What does organizing look like for DSA's right to counsel movement, especially during a pandemic? I mean, in previous episodes, I've spoken with criminal justice reform advocates, with a whole bunch of people who have had to improvise, kind of find new ways to safely organize, get people on board with what they're advocating for. What does it kind of day-to-day look like organizing for right to counsel in New Haven?
It's a great question. And I think it really plays into how right to counsel became a priority for Central Connecticut DSA as a chapter. It is extremely difficult to organize in the traditional ways that we are trained and we have experience in organizing, which is door-to-door, face-to-face, in a room together, brainstorming together. And we knew that we didn't want to put one another at risk. We didn't want to put anyone at risk whose doors we were knocking on. There are safe ways to do that. And we've been trying to do that, in coalition with the Cancel Rent Coalition. Khadijah, myself, Alice, others have been doing direct outreach to tenants with evictions in process and building those relationships. But we also saw that over the winter, with the spike in pandemic cases, with the national momentum around right to counsel. And I think that that's something that I hope we can come back to, because this is something that has really gained momentum the past 4 or 5 years. There are 7 states right now this year that have right to counsel bills in the process of potentially being passed, Connecticut being one of them, a vote happening as we speak today. But we saw this as something where, how can we fight for this at a systemic level, right? Where we're not only playing kind of whack-a-mole in terms of trying to respond to each individual eviction case, but we're looking at, what are the ways in which we can systemically address this problem and learn from people across the country and the work that they're doing. So what does that look like for us? A couple of important steps that we took. One was in late December, we launched a petition for right to counsel, and we started to do direct outreach to other organizations across the state, as Khadijah mentioned, and to really build a coalition around this movement. That's something that had not been done before, and it really gained a lot of momentum. And I think that speaks to something about, for those of us in DSA, our theory of change and our understanding of how change works. We can't just go up and up in terms of trying to be more and more elite in our responses. We have to make power itself contestable. And what that means is building power in our communities, between our organizations, and not just asking for things, but changing the shape of what power looks like. I think we've seen, honestly, this is beyond what we even thought was maybe even possible in terms of just the fire that's there behind right to counsel. And that is, on the one hand, a result of DSA's belief in people power, and on the other hand, and far more tragically, a reality of the fact that we exist in a society that's extremely exploitative and extremely extractive in terms of how it's devastating renter communities, and that is disproportionately communities of color.
And so I wondered, before we leave this thread, I want to ask maybe Alice one more time, or again, feel free to bounce it around, about the kind of actual work of organizing. Stephen gave a great example of the, turning to online petitions. I saw that, over 1,030 or some odd signatures you all have gotten signed in support of Right to Counsel. There's reaching out directly to other kind of like-minded organizations. Maybe Alice, could you speak a bit to some of the other work kind of bringing of talking with people directly, either making phone calls, or are you knocking on people's doors? I know, are you driving to the homes of places where people are getting evicted to both make sure that see if you can keep them in their homes and talk to them about Right to Counsel? Maybe if anything else comes to mind for the work that you all have done in the recent weeks, months, to build what Stephen called people power around the Right to Counsel movement.
Well, when COVID cases were lower over the summer, we were doing some door knocking in New Haven, trying to kickstart some tenant union conversations. When things got colder and the cases shot up, we decided to pause that. Many of our members are also working with Cancel Rent to reach out to individuals who are currently facing eviction, and building relationships there and helping connect them with resources. So there has been some door knocking and in-person communication as well. A lot of this is happening online through online petitions, contacting coalition org members, and contacting our own members, and making sure that they're well, if they have any needs, that we can connect them with resources. We want to make sure that we're also taking care of our own community. So I think Stephen or Khadijah might have more to say on that. Khadijah?
I can jump in quickly too to say that, as well as all of that, we've been holding pretty frequent, so we have, weekly meetings, but then we also have weekly phone banks to kind of call on legislators. And obviously that's something, we have a script, we have different email addresses and phone numbers, and that's something that we all could do independently on our own time. But having this weekly time on Tuesdays, if anyone wants to join, for people to kind of come together, even in this weird space of Zoom, and call your legislator, email your legislator, but also just kind of be able to ask questions about Right to Counsel, talk about what it is, talk about, maybe your concerns about your rights as a tenant. Having that space has been super important, I think, for us, for me at least, definitely, just being able to ask my own questions, being able to kind of voice my own anxieties about doing this kind of work during the pandemic. That's been super important. And then, also in terms of, we had the public hearing a week ago, last Thursday, and we did a lot of mobilization in the lead up to the public hearing. So, some of us, I was on that public hearing, that Zoom call, like all day, basically for 10 hours, just texting people, calling people when it was their time to go on, making sure that we had that one-on-one outreach and follow up with people, which also really speaks to kind of the disparities in access to that online hearing in the first place. A lot of tenants don't have the access to internet all the time to be able to be on Zoom for 10 hours. But also, I think the majority of us don't have 10 hours free to sit on a Zoom call and wait for your number to be called. And so the fact that we were able to, that we have enough of the community for folks to be able to look out for each other in that way was super important. And that's something that we've just built basically in the last 3 or 4 months. So that's been really exciting.
Khadijah, you also said that you grew up in New Haven. This is your home city, and that you've seen the city and especially its housing stock, landlord-tenant relations, change dramatically in the past decade. I don't know. Could you speak a bit more to what is? Could you try to articulate what that change has been? Has it been kind of concentration of most rental housing in the hands of fewer and fewer players, as I've written a lot about with the Mandy managements and Ocean managements of the world, or what? Kind of what have you seen change?
Yeah, so I can speak to this a little bit, and then I know other folks on this call have been tenants in New Haven longer than I have. But absolutely the concentration of the housing stock in the hands of a few major players. And then one other thing that has come up a lot for me when speaking with tenants doing cancel rent outreach is that because of this concentration and because of the fact that a lot of these landlords are not even in New Haven, they're either from out of New Haven or even out of state, tenants feel very, very kind of alienated from the landlord. Many of them don't even really know who the landlord is, because a lot of these companies act under different subsidiaries. So even like as, you know, an organizer doing outreach, it's difficult for me to tell, you know, who actually owns this LLC, right? Because Mandy has all these different names that they own their different houses, their different apartment complexes under. And yeah, the tenants that I speak to, it adds to the confusing process of what's already really an overwhelming process of an eviction case or a housing court case. When you don't even know really who your landlord is, you just have this huge management company, and you don't even really know who to reach out to when you have questions about your case. But yeah, and I'm sure others can speak to their experience renting here.
Do you mind if I jump in on that, Tom? Is that okay?
Please, yeah, please.
I mean, I think that it's really important. Why has the right to counsel movement caught fire, right? The last 5 years across the country, right? And I want to bring it back to New Haven, but you know, I don't think that we can really understand this unless we're understanding our position in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the foreclosure crisis. This was a crisis that led to such an enormous dispossession of wealth across the country by working class communities that it resulted in the reduction of Black American wealth by 50%, right? And we are dealing with the wake of that. That's the same process that led to certain large hedge funds and companies like Blackstone to become the largest landlords in the country. We elected a landlord president in 2016, right? And when we look at like these very, very large dynamics, they do impact us in New Haven as a global city because Stephen Schwartzman is the CEO of Blackstone. Stephen Schwartzman donated $150 million to Yale, got his name on the cultural center at Yale, started to push different kinds of opportunity zone investments in the Dixwell community in New Haven, right? We're talking about a disparity of power and a kind of power that's concentrated in global capital that's very difficult for anyone to deal with, like in our own lives, when we're dealing with paying rent, when we're dealing with eviction, when we're dealing with like the bad conditions of our apartments, and we're trying to just band together with one another to hold on, right? So I think that, you know, what DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, brings to this is a kind of analysis that can meet that scale that is so difficult for people to meet in their own lives, right? Because we are worried about those minutia. But it is very clear here in New Haven with Mandy, with Pike, with Yale, with these entities that are frankly devastating communities through their real estate speculation and their role as landlords in our communities. And I think what right to counsel does is it doesn't fix everything, but it puts in place a kind of systemic backstop that changes the relations of power, right? If 80% of landlords have representation and less than 7% of tenants have representation, that is a grotesque and appalling disparity of power. So I think we need to pull it back down into New Haven and New Haven as a global city.
Well, you are listening to, let me just quickly do a station ID, Alice, before throwing your way. You're listening to Pandemic Organizing. I'm your host, Tom Breen. It's a show about New Haveners working together to collectively address the short-term and long-term challenges posed by COVID-19. We're talking today all about right to counsel with 4 members of DSA New Haven, Alice Prale, Stephen Poland, Khadija Hussein, and Dalia Romanow, and about how tenant-landlord relations existed before the pandemic, how they're changing, and what we'd like to see them look like after this. Alice, I cut you off. Did you want to jump in response to something Stephen was saying?
Yeah, just briefly to tie our current moment to that 2008 foreclosure crash, the private equity companies were buying up these distressed assets, also known as people's homes, and that led to this massive redistribution of wealth. And we're seeing that same thing happen today. An investor in May of 2020, that was 2 months into the pandemic, was calling this one of the greatest buying opportunities of the century. So they see this. They see this as another way to continue to grab wealth and to consolidate the housing stock. And we're just seeing this repeating in our current situation.
Now, I want to maybe throw, I'm not sure who best to throw it to. I can say Dahlia, but again, feel free to bounce it around. Probably one of the concerns that I hear most frequently expressed by small landlords, large landlords, landlord attorneys alike, especially right now as the state's eviction moratorium, with exceptions, which we'll talk about, but the state's eviction moratorium remains in place. I hear all the time about landlords concerned that tenants are just not paying rent, living for free in their place, and landlords have no choice but to leave them in place. Can't kick them out unless they meet one of the exceptions. And so, especially small landlords are at risk of losing their own homes due to not being able to keep up with the various bills that they have to pay on utilities, on their mortgages, while tenants are getting a free ride. And then I also hear a lot of complaints about housing court judges being too sympathetic to tenants and usually siding with tenants to allow them to remain in place. I wonder if anyone could speak to those concerns, again, that I hear all the time from landlords, landlord attorneys, small and big alike.
Yeah, sure, I can speak to that. So, a few things in there. I think on the concern of small landlords about having tenants not paying rent, I have a few thoughts on that. I mean, first of all, there's this larger systemic issue that when you have small landlords who are forced because of the cost of living and the low wages to rely on tenants in order to pay their bills, then that's a systemic issue. The state should also be dealing with that. I don't disagree with that, but I don't think that they should be getting that money from people who are even more disadvantaged than them, from tenants who don't have any resources, who have lost jobs. I think there are very few tenants who are just sitting in apartments saying, oh, I'm just not going to pay the rent because I don't feel like it. For people who have lost their jobs, especially in the pandemic, if they're not paying rent, it's usually because they can't afford to. And the way that the eviction moratorium is structured, it's not that people are off the hook either for their rent. When it lifts, and it's going to lift, they're going to be on the hook. And so, honestly, the reality is, if tenants are not able to pay their rent, they're not going to be more or less able to pay that just because the landlord, feels like it's unfair. I guess having an attorney representing a tenant is actually often good for the landlord, even if they don't perceive it in that way, because attorneys can hook people up with rental assistance and other ways that rent would just not be paid at all. It's not going to come from some magical source that the attorney is going to keep back from the landlord, if that makes sense. And I'm sorry that there were a few pieces to your question. So
No, that's great. I don't know if anyone else before we move on, if anyone else wants to chime in on that. Again, the kind of core concerns I hear from landlord and landlord attorneys is that the eviction moratorium has kept people who don't pay rent in place, and that housing court judges are already overly sympathetic to tenants against landlords.
I could speak on that for a moment. So I think something that's important to highlight here is that everyone needs a home. Not everyone needs an investment property. Right now, tenants are trying to fight for rental assistance through these very complicated programs. And they're doing so in order to preserve their right to stay sheltered. We believe that burden should be shifted to the landlords, that landlords should have to go through this rental assistance. The money is going to them directly anyway. And the risk of their not getting a return on investment is just a very different stake than the risk of losing your home. So I think that's just an important frame while we're talking about this. And Stephen, I think, had something to add.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think Dahlia and Alice put it really, really well. And that notion of equal rights is so incredibly important. I don't think we can emphasize it enough, that less than 7% of tenants have legal representation when they face eviction. We, I think, grow up taking it for granted that when you're accused of something, you will have an equal right to defense. And while that is true in criminal cases, it is not true when you're threatened with the loss of your home, which is beyond perverse and beyond appalling. And it creates poverty. And we know from around the country, so many different places now, multiple municipalities that have passed right to counsel and instated right to counsel, and have either experienced a savings economically themselves or project to over the course of the next few years. But I want to just it's not just about those economic savings. One of the things that I think is just so incredibly important, especially if we call ourselves a democracy rooted in equal rights, is that across the country, without legal counsel, tenants almost never win their cases, but with counsel, 84% of tenants remain in their homes. So what does that tell us? It tells us that landlords, whether they want to or not, are leaning on the power disparity, the systemic power disparity, to get people out of their homes. And we're not seeing equal representation. This country is supposedly founded on equal representation. And I think that is what we're arguing, at its core, is that people who do not have private property should not be valued less than the private property of people who are investing, right? We need to value humans and human communities over the private property that's, making money through displacement of predominantly Black and brown communities.
Khadijah, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I was just going to add to this by saying that just based on my experience speaking with tenants who currently have eviction cases filed against them, every tenant I've spoken to is jumping through every, frankly, insane hoop that they can to receive rental assistance, right? So this kind of myth of the tenant just sitting in their home not paying rent because of the moratorium, I think that you'll find that if you speak to any tenant, it's not the case. Every tenant is doing everything they can to receive the rental assistance. And the fact is that there just isn't enough support, right? And one of those reasons is because there is no right to counsel. Tenants are going through this process alone. And then it's a statewide problem. If landlords have a problem paying rent, they should be the ones calling on the state to receive that rental assistance directly, right? Because right now, Connecticut was supposed to release statewide rental assistance for tenants in February. That rental assistance has still not come out. And there are folks who are relying on that to be able to pay their rent to their landlord. But rather than, having landlords calling on the state to pass that, or having lawyers involved in those cases being able to call on the state to release that rental assistance money, tenants are having to jump through all of these hoops completely on their own.
You mentioned conversations with tenants facing eviction that you've had. Could you maybe share a memory or a particularly memorable conversation without giving away the identity of the person you spoke to, but what's stuck in your head based on a kind of particular conversation you've had with a tenant who's facing eviction at this moment? And if right to counsel came up, great, but what sticks in your head about their circumstances?
Sure, I can talk about, I know one tenant who is facing an eviction at the end of this month. And has been calling various programs basically every single day to try and fill out an application for rental assistance. And keep in mind that these applications are often like literally tens and tens of pages long. And often it also require the landlord to fill out some of the application. And oftentimes landlords are not willing to do that. Or tenants don't even know who to contact because, like I said earlier, the landlord is this huge corporation. And so this tenant has been, reaching out to the different resources basically every single day, calling 211, and has either been turned away or been subject to this kind of bureaucracy that is incredibly anxiety inducing and forces a lot of people to basically just give up on getting help. They called 211 multiple times and were told that because they weren't on the direct risk of eviction, because they weren't 2 weeks away from being evicted, there was nothing that 211 could do for them, right? And so they're kind of in this state of limbo in which, because they're not 14 days yet away from their eviction, whenever it was that they called, they're being forced to just wait with no knowledge of what kind of assistance they can receive. And the psychological toll of that is just totally insane.
Stephen's brought up a few times throughout our conversation about how right to counsel is not necessarily something new, even if there does seem to be a lot of momentum around it nationwide right now. New York City has had right to counsel for a number of years. I believe San Francisco, Boulder, Philadelphia, I think all have right to counsel. I don't know, I'm not sure who this is best for, either Stephen or anyone else. What have you, in your research and organizing around right to counsel here in Connecticut, what have you learned about how right to counsel has worked in other cities around the country? How has it gone in New York City or in San Francisco? And I don't know, is there something that you think Connecticut needs to be paying special attention to in how those experiments have worked out elsewhere?
I can jump in briefly. So one thing I'll say, so for New York City, where right to counsel was passed, it was the first such legislation in the country. One, there has been a dramatic reduction in evictions overall. And then in the last year during the pandemic, there have been, I believe, 4 to 5 evictions executed in the entire year since March 2020, right? And that's a direct result, not just of right to counsel, but also the organizing campaign that surrounded right to counsel in New York City. The kind of coalition that came out of right to counsel back in 2016, 2017, when New York City was organizing for it, that coalition is still very much alive today. And they are focusing right now on expanding right to counsel, on expanding the protections for tenants, on building tenant power. And I think that's a really exciting thing for us in Connecticut to be able to see, that this coalition that we are building right now has the potential for this future in which there's a handful of evictions in 1 year, and ideally 0.
Yeah, just to back up Khadijah and then pass it over to Dahlia and Alice as well. Cleveland passed right to counsel 6 months ago, and they've seen a 93% reduction in evictions. I think that's just alarming. It's alarming not only in terms of the hopefulness that we have for right to counsel giving people equal rights and redressing these issues of racial justice, but how incredibly broken and exploitative and violent our current system is, right? That goes to show that if you simply provide people with the chance to defend themselves, it radically changes the existing dynamics under which landlords are removing people from their homes. And I think that there is actually, an argument here that this is actually good for particularly those, mythical kind of mom and pop landlords, in that, people say oftentimes they don't want to evict people. Well, this isn't just about housing, right? This isn't just about getting to that stage. We saw this in Stratford in December. We saw this in Hartford last month. When you bring in lawyers into and legal aid services into the discussion earlier on in the eviction process, you can come up with more favorable outcomes for both parties that actually save the state an immense amount of money, and in a pandemic, keeps all of us safer, right? So there is this question of, I would say for DSA in particular, what is this blind allegiance that we have to private property and to landlords that we're so unwilling to face the empirical facts? We have the data from around the country. The Right to Counsel movement has all of the data behind us. And the people who are questioning it are doing it out of hypotheticals. So what's holding them back aside from a kind of blind ideology that's irrational at root?
And this may be an obvious question, but I think it's an important one to at least state explicitly. I mean, so right to counsel is obviously a means to accomplish something. What is it that you all are hoping to accomplish? I think for people who don't spend a lot of time in housing court, you don't realize how important the process of mediation is, literally in hallways, plaintiffs and defendants or tenants and landlords negotiating with court-appointed mediators in the hallways. So if not to avoid eviction in the direction of achieving what would be a better outcome that you think right to counsel will hopefully or has resulted in other cities?
Speak to that. Or Khadijah, sorry, were you? Okay, yeah. I can speak to that. So yeah, I mean, I've actually kind of had the interesting privilege of spending time in housing court, both in Mass, where they don't have a right to counsel, and in New York, where they do. And I think, the big difference is just this huge shift in the way that the courts are run and the way that tenants are treated and in the way the sort of expectations of everyone going in and the culture there. You are still, yes, as you say, the reality of housing court is that in New York, where there is a right to counsel, still most cases are getting settled with agreements, not going before the judge to a trial. But when you have an attorney on the side of the tenant who knows that tenant's rights and knows what they can push for and knows how to participate meaningfully in that negotiation, because I think that we think of mediation as being fair as long as both sides have a chance to speak and to push back. But if a tenant is going into mediation and being told, if you don't agree to this, you're just gonna go before the judge and be kicked out in X number of days, then it really doesn't, and they're not told, you may have these defenses, or you may, be able to get access to this resource that will help you pay your rent, or help you to fix the issue that you've been having with your landlord, then I think tenants really don't meaningfully feel like they're able to participate in that process, or get good results. And I think it's really telling that the results have shown, even in places that already have mediation, already have rental assistance programs, it's not until the right to counsel passes and people start getting access to attorneys that you start seeing these really incredible results that others have shared. So I won't share more statistics, but this huge reduction in evictions, this huge increase in tenancies that are able to be preserved, happens when you have right to a lawyer on your side doing that advocacy.
Alice, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to also point out the power dynamic here in that landlords are very overrepresented in our legislature at all levels, both in Connecticut and many other states, as well as at the national level. So 7% of US taxpayers are landlords. Those are the small mom and pop landlords, 7% of taxpayers. The housing committee is made up of 33% of landlords. And we haven't done full analysis of the full legislature yet. That's the next step. But seeing that dynamic, that landlords have the power in the legislature to make these decisions, and they're making these decisions in favor of landlords generally. I think it's really important that we build more tenant power and get more tenants into legislature so that we can have agency over our housing, that the people who are most impacted are the ones who are actually making the decisions.
Yeah, and then just briefly to Alice's point about building tenant power, and to your question, Tom, about what does right to counsel do? I think it is very important to say that, you know, right to counsel is not an end goal or a stopping point. It doesn't give tenants the right to stay in their homes. It doesn't give us a right to be housed, but it's an incredibly important step in moving us towards a world in which that's possible, right? And one very concrete way in which that's true is that right now, we are organizing as hard as we can to meet individual crises, right? With Cancel Rent, with DSA, every tenant that has an eviction, we are trying to meet those tenants where they're at and try to get them rental support, try to get them legal assistance. But it's not a sustainable model. It's like playing whack-a-mole with all of these evictions, right? You know, trying to meet new eviction cases as they arise. And yeah, we don't have the volunteers to knock on every single door across the state. We don't have the capacity to deal with every single individual crisis as it arises. And what right to counsel does is that it kind of moves us a little bit away from that constant individual crisis and enables us to do some real collective organizing, right? Like, you know, as Stephen says, like there are 40,000 tenants in Connecticut facing eviction once the moratorium lifts. That's a huge number of people. We don't have the capacity to meet every single one of those crises head on unless we have something more systemic like right to counsel, which enables us to then do the organizing to actually build tenant power rather than being kind of suffocated, I would say, as we are now with kind of this constant state of crisis.
I think that's a perfect transition. If I may, Steve, for the last, unfortunately, we have maybe only 6 or 7 minutes left, but I want to really talk a bit about DSA New Haven, even broader, you know, bigger picture than just the right to counsel movement. So, you know, DSA, I think of this as a fundamentally political organization. I think that throughout the conversation, you've really been tying, you know, the connections between political work and tenant advocacy and housing work. But I wonder if anyone here, either Stephen or anyone else, could talk a bit about what New Haven DSA is, how long it's been around. I think a lot of people have followed the Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns. I have probably also seen just the tremendous surge in DSA membership across the country over the past 5 years. How long has New Haven DSA been around, and what do you all aspire to do? Maybe to Alice first about New Haven DSA, mini history and goals, but happy to bounce it around.
Yeah, so I think in the New Haven DSA, we are fairly focused on this housing justice work, as well as there's a big push for a Medicare for all. But I think right now our biggest priority in the New Haven branch of the DSA is building capacity, building organizing trainings, to making sure that everyone is prepared to really get in the trenches and do this work. So if anybody is listening, and particularly these ideas appeal to you and you want to get into organizing work, now is actually a really, really good time to get involved. And if there's something that you would like to lead, we love having people like jump in with new ideas and push new things. This housing justice work came out of a handful of us setting aside time on Sunday mornings and trying to just figure it out. So yeah, I think that building capacity and organizing trainings is really important to us right now. Stephen,
roughly how many people belong to New Haven DSA roughly these days? And was New Haven DSA founded recently, or was it founded a while ago and this is a resurgence?
Tell me a bit about that. So the Central Connecticut chapter, which covers much more than New Haven, has been around for a while. I don't have specific dates. The New Haven branch sort of revitalized in this last year. So I'd say that's probably the timeline on the New Haven branch, and we're trying to really build up that work right now, and building up what exactly are the priorities in New Haven for the organizers who are interested in doing this work. Stephen might have.
And do you know how? I'm sorry. Before,
Sorry.
I don't know if there may not be an answer to this, but does anyone know how many people belong to New Haven DSA?
Oh, yes. So I believe it was 250 in New Haven and about 500 in the Central Connecticut chapter. So we have a really strong presence in New Haven, and we have a lot that we can move things. We have people power, we're building organizing capacity, and there's a lot that we can do here in New Haven. And the more people join and bring their skills and leadership and their energy, the more that we can change and the more we can make things better here in New Haven.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that a little bit, Tom, I mean, I think that, for myself, I've lived in New Haven for about 12 years now. And I was someone who was active in, for instance, the 2011 aldermanic campaigns that, it's been a decade, right? And that incredible year where I'm from Wisconsin, there was the labor uprising and capital occupation in Wisconsin. There was Occupy Wall Street. There was also this huge, sweeping, transformative working class movement to change the shape of the Board of Alders here in New Haven. And I think, we know the power of various working class organizations and unions and community organizations in New Haven. I think DSA is working as hard as we can to open up space for taking leadership across different intersections of these movements, right? So you might be a member of another organization. I think you're more than welcome to join into DSA and move your issue through the ways that we're trying to organize, right? So I want to bring up, just for instance, there's a movement to defund and dismantle the Yale Police Department. This is a really important issue for us, right? We are looking at how does that intersect with right to counsel? Meaning, how do we identify places in which the criminalization and punishment system intersects with the housing system? Can we identify those spaces in a concrete way and work collectively across our different organizations and communities to build coalitions and build a movement to dismantle those and build something more desirable for an actually survivable future? And I'm getting notification that Right to Counsel just passed in the Housing Committee. So, that's awesome.
Great timing.
Great, yes, great. What a timely conversation. We'll certainly include that in the article about our interview here. I'm going to ask one more very quick question before I'm going to ask one of you to let people know who do want to get more involved with DSA and the Right to Counsel movement, where they go, what they follow, how they sign up. But first, either Stephen or Alice or anyone else, this is a mayoral election year in New Haven, and it looks like it's going to be a contested one. Stephen, you spoke about the 2011 local politics being such a formative kind of political experience. We've got incumbent Mayor Justin Elicker, who I believe one of the first press conferences he held was in support of a federal right to counsel bill that Rosa DeLauro was sponsoring. And then it looks like his challenger is going to be Karen DuBois Walton, who's the head of the city's public housing agency and a big support of a lot of housing reform bills at the state legislature. Does New Haven DSA plan on getting involved in the New Haven mayoral race in any way? And if so, do you have a preferred candidate already? Looks like that's being kicked over to Stephen.
I'm just going to say no. I mean, I don't think that there is any commitment whatsoever. We're not solely electorally politics focused is actually probably where I would start, and that's why, as Alice said, what is New Haven's priority? Right to counsel, Medicare for all, the Yale police, what are the issues that actually face people on the ground in the way that their lives meet, these systems? I think we've gotten into a lot of trouble in a variety of our organizations by being sucked into electoral politics. Not that it's not important, but as being all politics, right? And so I think for DSA, maybe not, but we're going to feel that out. We're going to have a democratic discussion on that, and there's absolutely no commitment on that whatsoever.
So we've only got 30 seconds left. So this is the plugs portion of the interview. So if someone's interested in finding out more about DSA New Haven, about the Right to Counsel movement here in Connecticut, in New Haven, where do they go? What do they do? what else do you want to encourage people to check out? Maybe if I go to Alice, it sounds like maybe perhaps you could do it, or kick it up to someone else.
Khadijah, do you know anything about what's going on with Cancel Rent's tenant talks?
Sure, I can plug Cancel Rent is doing weekly tenant talks. You can find them on Cancel Rent's Facebook page. They just changed the time, so I don't want to say what time they are at because I think it just changed. But Cancel Rent on Connecticut on Facebook, they post the events every week. It's just going to be a space for tenants to come together, talk about issues they may be facing, and get advice.
And what about DSA New Haven in particular? Is there a Facebook page or something else that people can check out?
For now, the Central Connecticut DSA Facebook page, Democratic Socialists of America Facebook page would probably be the best way. We also post all of our events, the housing justice meetings, the phone banks, all of that goes through that Facebook page. As we're building up the branch, hoping to have more public facing New Haven focused. But for now, yeah, that Central Connecticut Democratic Socialists of America on Facebook.
Well, we'll make sure to link to that on the Independent. And that's it. That's it for our conversation for this episode of Pandemic Organizing. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and a big thank you to Alice Prale, Stephen Poling, Khadijah Hussain, and Dalia Romanow for talking about the Right to Counsel movement that was the bill just voted on by the Housing Committee. Looks like it's going out of Housing Committee over to the House floor. We'll see what happens with that next. Thank you so much for being on the show, and we'll talk with you all soon.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Harry. Thanks for making it happen.